Mrs. Thompson's classroom was always quiet, too quiet. The students sat stiff, their pencils scratching against paper, afraid to make a single mistake. She was the kind of teacher who ruled with fear, and she had her favorites. One thing was clear: she didn't like kids who didn't look like her. That's why when James walked in, she frowned. James was a 10-year-old black boy with bright eyes and a wide smile. He had just moved to Lincoln Elementary, a mostly white school in a small town in Illinois. He was excited to make new friends, but he quickly realized something was off. From the moment James stepped into the classroom, Mrs. Thompson treated him differently. She looked him up and down, her lips pursed. "Take a seat in the back," she said coldly. The other kids whispered, sneaking glances at James. Some of them felt bad, but no one dared to stand up to Mrs. Thompson. She had a way of making kids feel small, and James was no exception. The bullying started almost immediately. She ignored his raised hand when he had a question. She rolled her eyes when he spoke. She even marked his correct answers wrong. One day, during a math lesson, James answered a question correctly. He knew he did because he had always been great at math. But Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "Wrong," she snapped. James frowned. "But I did. Did I ask for back talk?" she interrupted, her sharp voice cutting through the room. The class went silent. "I suggest you keep quiet and learn something for once." James swallowed hard, his hands balled into fists under his desk, but he said nothing. Every day it got worse. If he finished his work early, she accused him of cheating. If he made a small mistake, she made sure the whole class knew about it. And when he finally got tired of the unfairness and told her she was wrong about something, she sent him to the principal's office. What she didn't know was that the principal, Mr. Carter, was James's father. James sat in the principal's office, his head low. Mr. Carter walked in and sat across from him. "What happened, son?" he asked gently. James hesitated. He didn't want to sound like he was complaining. "Mrs. Thompson doesn't like me," he finally said. "She treats me differently." Mr. Carter's face hardened. "Tell me everything." James did. He told him about the ignored questions, the wrongly marked answers, and the constant humiliation. Mr. Carter listened carefully, nodding slowly. When James finished, his father sighed. "Go back to class, son. I'll handle this." Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson was in her classroom, feeling proud of herself. She believed she had put James in his place. But when the classroom door suddenly opened and Mr. Carter stepped in, her face went pale. "Mrs. Thompson, I need a word with you. Now." The class gasped. Mrs. Thompson stood up, trying to keep her composure. "Of course, Mr. Carter," she said, forcing a smile. They walked to the hallway. Mr. Carter turned to her with a look so serious it made her heart race. "Tell me, Mrs. Thompson," he said slowly, "how long have you been treating my son this way?" Mrs. Thompson's face turned white. "I didn't know he was your son," she stammered. Mr. Carter crossed his arms. "So you admit you were treating him differently?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. "Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Carter continued, "my son is an excellent student, yet for some reason you've been targeting him. If you treat him this way, I can only imagine how you treat other students." She gulped. "It's just a misunderstanding." Mr. Carter's voice was firm. "No, Mrs. Thompson, it's racism, and it ends today." The next morning, the entire school was buzzing with whispers. Something big was happening. Mrs. Thompson stood in front of her class, looking nervous. Mr. Carter walked in, clearing his throat. "Good morning, class," he said. "I have an announcement." The students straightened up. James watched closely. "Mrs. Thompson will no longer be teaching at Lincoln Elementary," Mr. Carter said firmly. Gasps filled the room. Some students looked shocked, others looked relieved. Mrs. Thompson turned red. "Sir, please," Mr. Carter raised a hand, cutting her off. "This school has no room for teachers who discriminate against students," he said. "We hold our staff to a higher standard, and you have failed to meet that." She looked around for support, but no one spoke for her. Even the students who had been her favorites stayed quiet. Mr. Carter turned to James and gave him a small nod before walking out. The weight on James's chest lifted as Mrs. Thompson gathered her things and left the classroom for the last time. James smiled for the first time since he arrived at Lincoln Elementary. Justice had been served, and he was finally free. Later that day, James walked through the halls, feeling lighter. Some of the students who had ignored him before smiled at him now. A few even came up to apologize for not standing up for him earlier. He forgave them, knowing that fear had kept them silent. At lunch, he sat with a group of new friends. "You know," said one of them, a girl named Sarah, "you're really brave." James smiled. "I just wanted to be treated fairly." And from that day forward, Lincoln Elementary was never the same again. The weeks that followed were a turning point for James and the school. The atmosphere in the classroom shifted dramatically. The new teacher, Miss Rodriguez, was warm and encouraging. She made it a point to call on every student equally, and she celebrated their successes, no matter how small. James felt seen for the first time since he had started at Lincoln Elementary. Miss Rodriguez noticed James's talent for math right away. She encouraged him to join the school's math club, which he did eagerly. The club met twice a week after school, and James quickly became one of its star members. He loved the challenge of solving complex problems and the camaraderie of working with other students who shared his passion. One afternoon, as the math club was wrapping up, Miss Rodriguez pulled James aside. "James, I've been looking over your work, and I think you have a real gift," she said. "There's a regional math competition coming up in a few months. I'd like you to represent our school." James's eyes widened. "Me? Really?" Miss Rodriguez smiled. "Absolutely. You've got what it takes. I'll help you prepare, and we'll work on some advanced problems together. What do you say?" James nodded eagerly. "I'd love to." The next few months were a whirlwind of preparation. Miss Rodriguez worked with James after school, challenging him with problems that pushed his limits. James thrived under her guidance, and his confidence grew with each session. He even started helping some of the other students in the club, explaining concepts they found difficult. The day of the competition finally arrived. James felt a mix of excitement and nerves as he walked into the large auditorium where the event was being held. Students from schools all over the region were there, each one looking just as determined as he was. The competition was intense. James solved problem after problem, his focus unwavering. When the results were announced, he could hardly believe his ears. He had taken first place. The applause was deafening as he walked up to receive his trophy. Ms. Rodriguez was beaming with pride, and even Mr. Carter, who had come to support him, gave him a thumbs up from the audience. Back at school, James's victory was celebrated with a small assembly. The students cheered as he was called up to the stage to share his experience. James looked out at the sea of faces, many of whom had once ignored or underestimated him, and felt a surge of pride. "I just want to say thank you to everyone who believed in me," he said, "especially Miss Rodriguez and my dad. And to anyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong, just know that you do. You just have to keep going and believe in yourself." The applause was thunderous, and James felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the trophy in his hands. He had not only proven himself, but had also shown his peers that fairness and perseverance could lead to incredible things. In the months that followed, James became a role model at Lincoln Elementary. He started a peer tutoring program, helping younger students with their math homework. He even gave a presentation to the school board about the importance of inclusivity and fairness in education. Mr. Carter couldn't have been prouder. "You've made a real difference here, James," he said one evening as they sat together in the living room. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone at that school." James smiled. "I just wanted to make things better, Dad, for me and for everyone else." And he had. Lincoln Elementary was no longer the same school it had been when James first arrived. It was a place where every student felt valued, where fairness and kindness were the rule, not the exception. As James looked back on his journey, he knew that the challenges he had faced had shaped him into the person he was today. He had learned the importance of standing up for what was right, of believing in himself, and of never giving up, no matter how tough things got. And as he walked through the halls of Lincoln Elementary, now filled with laughter and camaraderie, James knew that he had found not just a school, but a home.